Our speaker this morning is Dr. Michael Ward. Most of you heard him last night, but for those of you who weren't with us, Dr. Ward is on the faculty of theology at Oxford University. He's professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. He's a renowned expert on C.S. Lewis, whose book, Planet Narnia, transformed Narnia's studies. And his most recent book is titled After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man. Now, many of you have read The Abolition of Man. It's a remarkable little book that shows the prescience of Lewis, who in many ways clearly anticipated much of some of the most serious pathologies of our age. And the title of Dr. Ward's talk today is C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, Philosophy or Theology. Please join me once again in welcoming Dr. Michael Ward.
Good morning. Thank you, those of you who came last night, for coming back for a second dose. Hope it's not too painful an experience listening to this foreign Englishman twice in, 16 hours or whatever it is. I trust that the heavens shed restful and peaceful influences on you overnight. I'm going to talk this morning, as Dr. Mitchell said, about the subject of my new book. My new book is After Humanity, and its subject is the abolition of man. And I'm going to explore whether it's best understood as a work of philosophy, pure and simple, or as a work of philosophy with an undercurrent, a subtle infusion of theology. The keen-eyed among you, I'm very delighted, by the way, to see so many men in ties, and so many smartly dressed ladies too. My tie is the tie of the University of St Andrews in Scotland, where I did my PhD. St Andrews is also the first university in the world to have awarded an honorary doctorate to C.S. Lewis. They gave him an honorary doctorate in Divinity in the 1940s, the first of 5 honorary doctorates he got from universities around the world, and the only one in theology. And it's remarkable that it should have come to him in the 1940s, before he had published much of his most famous work, including Narnia, and works like Surprised by Joy and The Four Loves and Till We Have Faces. St Andrews was very prescient in seeing that Lewis was going to be a great contributor to theology. The Abolition of Man, is it a work of philosophy or a work of philosophy and theology? That is the question. The book originated as a series of lectures that Lewis delivered during the Second World War. It was an annual series of lectures at the University of Durham. Durham is a beautiful cathedral city a few hundred miles north of Oxford, where Lewis lived. And this annual lecture series was called the Riddle Memorial Lecture Series. Each year, the lecturer was asked to address a subject concerning the relation between religion and contemporary development of thought. Lewis's 3 lectures were entitled Men Without Chests, The Way, and The Abolition of Man, and they were delivered on successive nights in February 1943. They were the 15th series of Riddle Memorial Lectures, and here is the poster advertising his talks. In these lectures, I'm sure most of you know all this because most of you have some familiarity with the abolition of man, but pardon me for just recapitulating the essence of the work. In these lectures, Lewis defends the objectivity of value, pointing to the universal moral law, which he maintains all great philosophical and religious traditions have recognized. We have a responsibility, he says, to hand on to our children this generous, fruitful, and civilizing ethical inheritance, because it defines our very humanity. Step outside this tradition, and we cease to be human, we bring about the abolition of man. It is a short work, only about 20,000 words in length, and it is Lewis's most purely philosophical work. Very highly regarded among a surprisingly wide range of people. The Oxford philosopher John Lucas dubs it a powerful argument reminiscent of Plato, Pascal, and Dostoevsky, and worth elaborating afresh in each generation. English literature professor Tony Nuttall, who was tutored by Lewis at Oxford, claims that the argument thoroughly routs whole volumes of Nietzsche and Sartre. The book has been cited on the floor of the US Congress. There's glory for you. It has been quoted by the chair of the US President's Council on Bioethics during the first term of Bush 43. Philosopher Leo Strauss recommended his students to read it. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama and novelist environmentalist Wendell Berry have found its analysis compelling and referred to it in support of their own work. The keen accuracy of its moral diagnosis has been praised by Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, before he became Pope Benedict XVI. The contemporary British philosopher John Gray calls the work prophetic. Now, I highlight John Gray, pictured here, because, well, partly because he recently broadcast about the abolition of man on BBC Radio, bringing the work to a whole new audience, but more because John Gray is an atheist. John Gray has no belief in God, let alone the God of Christianity, yet he calls the abolition of man not only prophetic, but as relevant now as when it first came out, if not more so. Why would an atheist give such warm approval to an argument by Lewis, the famous Christian apologist? I ask this question not to imply that an atheist could never find value in a Christian's writings, any more than I'd want to imply that a Christian could never find value in an atheist's writings. I ask the question in order to foreground one of the more important aspects of the abolition of man that we get clear as we assess it, namely the fact that it is not a Christian work. That is to say, it's not an explicitly Christian work. Lewis says this: "Though I am myself a theist, and indeed a Christian, I am not here attempting any even indirect argument for theism. Though I am myself a theist, and indeed a Christian, I am not here attempting any even indirect argument for theism. The abolition of man doesn't rest on a belief in God, still less on a belief in the Christian God. Lewis is not attempting even an indirect argument for theism, let alone a direct argument for Christianity. So, if he's not attempting a religious argument, what is he attempting? He's attempting to demonstrate that all human beings unavoidably consider certain states of affairs or certain modes of conduct good in and of themselves. He quotes Plato and Aristotle. He refers to ancient Judaism and early Hinduism. He cites the New Testament and church fathers such as St. Augustine of Hippo. In an appendix to the book, he provides a list of 8 key moral laws, such as duty to one's elders, duty to one's children and posterity, the duty of truth-telling, the law of magnanimity, and various others. But Lewis does not assemble all these traditions under a Christian umbrella term, such as natural law. He uses the term natural law just once in the entire book, but he doesn't make it his favored term, nor does he refer even once to the greatest Christian exponent of natural law philosophy, Thomas Aquinas. Though he mentions the Apostle Paul Interestingly, Lewis does not cite the second chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans, which is one of the key texts for a Christian understanding of natural law, natural theology, where Paul says that when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts. So, if Lewis is not going to call this universal objective moral code natural law, what is he going to call it? Perhaps rather surprisingly, he settles on a Chinese term. The Chinese, he says, also speak of a great thing, the greatest thing, called the Tao. It is the reality beyond all predicates. It is the way in which the universe goes on, the way in which things everlastingly emerge, stilly and tranquilly, into space and time. It is also the way which every man should tread in imitation of that cosmic and supercosmic progression, conforming all activities to that great exemplar. This conception in all its forms, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian, and Oriental alike, I shall henceforth refer to, for brevity, simply as the Tao. This is a very deliberate rhetorical strategy on Lewis's part. By choosing this Chinese term, he, as it were, seeks to wrong foot those who would assume that his argument is just another standard Christian argument for natural law. The preference for this non-Christian term, Tao, sometimes disconcerts readers who come to the Abolition of Man after encountering Lewis's more explicitly Christian writings. They tend to assume that this book too will be an example of direct Christian apologetics, arguing from Christian premises to a Christian conclusion. And it surprises them to find Jesus being quoted in the same breath as Confucius, and the Bible being put on a par with the Hindu Vedas. But actually, it should come as no surprise to anybody who has read C.S. Lewis at all carefully, because he had made a very similar point about the commonalities of different religious traditions in several places prior to the publication of Abolition. For instance, in his first work of non-fiction apologetics, The Problem of Pain, he writes this: "What is common to Zarathustra, Jeremiah, Socrates, Gautama, Christ, and Marcus Aurelius is something pretty substantial." He then adds a footnote explaining, "I mention the incarnate God among human teachers to emphasize the fact that the principal difference between him and them lies not in ethical teaching, which is here my concern, but in person and office." And that's a very important point. Lewis is not at all resiling from his Christian commitments about the uniqueness of Christ, but he's saying the uniqueness of Christ rests principally in who he is, and what he did, rather than what he taught. A very important distinction. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis is quite clear that he's only arguing for the objectivity of value. The question as to whether this position implies a supernatural origin for the Tao is a question I'm not here concerned with. And readers who wish to see how he proceeds when that is his concern would do well to read the opening chapters of Mere Christianity, entitled Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. In that book, Mere Christianity, Lewis starts out with a sort of popular version of his argument from the Abolition of Man, and then proceeds to develop it into a theistic case, and then, of course, ultimately a Christian case. But here in the Abolition of Man, he's only concerned to get, as it were, to first base. He'll leave religious considerations aside. And this resolutely non-religious framework of abolition is one of the major reasons why it has appealed to such a broad readership, including atheists like John Gray. The Abolition of Man propounds an argument that doesn't require its adherents to be signed up members of particular religious confessions. And I emphasize this point for two reasons. First, because too much of the commentary on abolition rather lazily assumes that it is an explicitly Christian argument. And there is some basic similarity, to be sure, some continuity between the two arguments, but they are different, they're distinct, and it's important to keep them distinct. Abolition, as Lewis noted in a letter, is a work of ethics, not a work of theology. In Britain, we had a very notable jurist in the latter half of the last century, one Lord Hailsham. He was head of the British judicial system for longer than any other jurist of the 20th century. And Lord Hailsham has written an interesting little book about the abolition of man, in which he says, in C.S. Lewis's case, the belief in what he called the Tao pre-existed in his mind to any religion and may therefore be discussed in isolation from any theological implications. These may, or may not, be read into it or deduced from it. The second reason for emphasizing that abolition is not a Christian work is to clarify Lewis's point about the universality of objective value. People really can and do come to moral judgments very similar to those of Christianity without being Christians. In an address to the Oxford Socratic Club, Lewis maintained that Christian moral principles are not different from moral principles, and that the real problem is how to obey these moral principles. And that's the unique thing about Christianity, that it gives us resources for keeping the moral law and gives us new reasons, new motives for keeping the moral law, new spiritual power to keep the moral law. And this view about the similarity between Christian moral principles and moral principles in general is certainly not unique to C.S. Lewis. I've already mentioned Joseph Ratzinger. Let me mention him again. Ratzinger says, the moral vision of Christian faith is not something particularly Christian. Christianity is rather the synthesis of the great moral intuitions of humanity from a new center which holds them all together. That new center, of course, being the person of Jesus Christ. He keeps the law, and he enables us to keep the law if we live in him. The abolition of man, then, is not in the ordinary sense of the word a religious work. It's a moral or ethical work, yes, but not strictly speaking religious. Though Lewis was a great Christian apologist, he didn't always feel the need to operate from a strictly Christian apologetic standpoint. He looked for points of contact with other perspectives. Christianity is not utterly incommensurable with other traditions. There are points of contact, whole tranches of overlap, in fact, and these need to be acknowledged, he says, partly out of basic honesty and politeness, but partly because a recognition of similarities can be useful, can be a step towards social, political, ecumenical harmony. Christians don't always need to be harping on the distinctives of Christianity. Sometimes it is worth emphasizing the points of commonality. Now, if it's surprising to find a Christian apologist not explicitly defending Christianity, it's perhaps equally surprising to find a Riddle Memorial lecturer not focusing on religion. After all, the Riddle Memorial lectures were established, as I mentioned, to address a subject concerning the relation between religion and contemporary development of thought. Where, then, does religion feature in the argument Lewis presents? He said that his abolition lectures were a work of ethics, not theology. Has he then failed to observe the terms of his lectureship? How does religion come into the case he presents? In one obvious way, religion features in the appendix, where Lewis cites many different religious traditions. And insofar as those religious traditions are being undermined by the contemporary development of thought in a subjectivist direction, his lectures do satisfy the conditions of the lecture series well enough. In a less obvious, but possibly more important way, Lewis may have felt that he could fulfill the conditions of the lecture series by taking the word religion in its strict etymological sense. Religion. Think of ligatures and ligaments, that which binds. Think of the oath of obedience made by a member of a religious order to his superior. Religion, in this etymological sense, is that which ties things back together, which integrates diverse perspectives. And in that sense, the abolition of man could fairly be characterized as a profoundly religious argument, because behind the diversity of the moral traditions that Lewis cites lies a strong, central, unifying principle, namely belief in or recognition of objective value. It's this belief in objective value that precedes what we ordinarily call religion: Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity. Recognition of objective value is a kind of religion, underlying them all, and indeed all traditional philosophies and coherently logical systems of thought whatsoever. You can only be a follower of a religion, Lewis is implying, if you are a human being first. And it is this acceptance of objective value that makes us human. It's this belief in the absolute validity of what he calls the ultimate platitudes of practical reason that makes us distinctly human. Long before we are Stoic or Native American or Aristotelian or Platonist or Christian or humanist or whatever, we are human, he argues, by dint of this belief in objective value. This common belief in objective value doesn't resolve every difficulty between or within religious traditions. In a manner of speaking, it actually creates those difficulties. Why would you consider it a difficulty if someone took a different view from you on something, unless there was an objective reality to which both you and your interlocutor were trying to gain access? As Lewis writes elsewhere, it is moral codes that create problems of casuistry, that is, moral adjudication, just as the rules of chess create chess problems. Nonetheless, only by recognizing objective value does one have grounds for hoping that a resolution of moral differences can be obtained through reasonable and peaceful means. Without such a shared premise as a bedrock, we can't dispute matters rationally with one another, but only assert our particular subjective preferences and try to shout down those whose preferences conflict with our own. That's how you proceed in a subjectivist world. To deny the core principle of objective value is to deny what makes us human, Lewis argues. It leads either to a false spirituality or to the law of the jungle. Belief in objective value is then a precondition for belief in theism and Christianity. So we could view the abolition of man as preparatory to religion, a necessary underpinning for any religious argument whatsoever. In a letter of 1953, Lewis writes, "I believe we ought to work not only at spreading the gospel, that certainly, but also at a certain preparation for the gospel. It's necessary to recall many to the law of nature before we talk about God. For Christ promises forgiveness of sins, but what is that to those who, since they do not know the law of nature, do not know that they have sinned? Who will take medicine unless he knows he's in the grip of disease? Moral relativity is the enemy we have to overcome before we tackle atheism. So we see here that Lewis believed that acceptance of objective value to be a foundation stone of both theism and Christianity, but only if it was followed by a serious attempt to live in accordance with the objective value revealed by the natural law. In another letter that he wrote, he says, the attempt to practice the Tao is certainly the right line. Have you read the Analects of Confucius? He ends up by saying, this is the Tao, I do not know if anyone has ever kept it. That's significant. One can really go direct from there to the Epistle to the Romans. And I presume that Lewis has in mind here Romans chapter 3, verse 23, maybe Romans 7, 24, as the key points of contact between Confucius's observation that no one is able to keep the law and Christianity. In those verses from the letter to the Romans, St. Paul says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord." And if we refer to Lewis and his own life, his own spiritual progression, we can observe that very process unfolding in his own experience, because it was only after attempting to obey his own conscience for a year and failing, it was only after he tried to live up to the natural law and realized that he couldn't, that he threw himself on the redemptive mercy of Jesus Christ. He didn't have the resources to live in a morally upright way on his own. However much he could perceive some of the objectivity of the natural law, he couldn't obey it. Ethical behavior, he argues, is always in the long run, if honestly and wholeheartedly undertaken, directed towards Christian theology. As he puts it in his autobiography, you must not even try to do the will of the Father unless you are prepared to know of the doctrine of Christianity. And there he's channeling John 7:17. So we can say of the Abolition of Man that although it's not a Christian apologetic, or even an apologetic for theism, it can properly be considered by the author's own admission as a kind of pre-apologetic. It's trying to get people to first base. You can only be a Christian if you're a human being first. So let's sit down, as it were, and establish what it means to be a human being. And one of the things it means, ethically, morally, to be a human being, is to have an awareness of objective value and of our failure to live up to the standards of objective value as revealed in the moral law. Human conscience and human guilt and shame about failing to live up to our consciences, those are universal human experiences, and quite properly so. But there's another and subtler, more implicit way in which Lewis's Christianity shines through this philosophical work. And that has to do with his picture of the human person as a composite reality. We're not simple as human beings, we're complex. We're made up of three parts: the head, the belly, and the chest. In our heads, we think. In our bellies, we feel. In our chests, we integrate thought and feeling. Lewis says this: the head rules the belly through the chest being the seat of magnanimity, of emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiments. The chest, magnanimity, sentiment, these are the indispensable liaison officers between cerebral man and visceral man. It may even be said that it is by this middle element that man is man, for by his intellect he's mere spirit, and by his appetite mere animal. At the core of the Abolition of Man, then, is a claim in philosophical anthropology It's the chest that makes us human. Without the chest, we either evaporate upwards into pure spirituality, like the angels. The angels, after all, have intellect. But becoming like the angels is not at all a good thing for a human being. First of all, because some of the angels are demons. And secondly, because we are embodied creatures, and we ought to respect our nature as embodied creatures. But the other alternative is to devolve downwards into the belly and become like the beasts. But combine the angel and the beast, and you have man, the rational animal. One of my favorite novels is E.M. Forster's Howard's End. You may recall that the epigraph to Howard's End is the two words, only connect. Only connect the angel and the beast, and you have a human being. Only connect the cerebral and the visceral, and you have the anthropological. The chest is the seat of magnanimity, and of course, to be magnanimous is literally to be great-souled. Magna, great, anima, soul. An angel has a rational soul. A beast has a sensitive soul. Man, however, has reason and sense. The human soul, therefore, is the great soul. The soul that interlocks spirit with matter, intellect with sensation. And that magnanimity, Lewis argues, resides in our chest. Of course, this is a philosophical model of the human person, not a physiological model. But amusingly, Lewis did have an interest in the chest physically considered. And here's a little sort of comic interlude, just to keep you awake on this Friday morning. As I was Googling Lewis, men without chests, I came across a very interesting image. It was this. Now, Jack Lewis was apparently a 1920s strongman, a real historical figure. And as you can see, he's there advertising his chest expander. Be strong, keep strong, with Jack Lewis's progressive expander. And if I were to sum up the Abolition of Man in a single sentence, it would be, expand your chest. But ironically, this is where we come to the point of physiology, C.S. Lewis, as he grew up, had a very undeveloped chest, and you can see it somewhat in this picture of him as a young boy. His father, Albert Lewis, was very concerned about Jack Lewis. You know that I mentioned last night that C.S. Lewis is always known as Jack. That's why that image of the strongman is so amusing. But Albert Lewis was worried that his son Jack had a weak chest. He wrote letters saying, I've never known a boy with a weaker chest. And when Lewis was sent off to school, Lewis wrote back saying, I've been condemned by the school doctor to join the ranks of people who do special exercises for delicate chests in the gym. And later, when he went to Oxford and learnt to row, his father was very pleased. Rowing, Albert Lewis said, is the very best exercise for putting a chest on a man. And interestingly, this concern for a strong chest, physically considered, not just philosophically considered, also makes its way into the Narnia Chronicles. Lewis slips a few references in to, first of all, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe about King Peter, who by the end of the story becomes a tall and deep-chested man. And in the final chronicle of Narnia, The Last Battle, we encounter an evil ape called Shift. And Shift tells us what weak chests apes always have. Modern philosophy of the last 200 or 300 years, however, has given up concentrating on the chest, has abandoned the attempt to defend the union of head and belly, the integration of the cerebral and the visceral. Alistair MacIntyre, the philosopher at Notre Dame, in his influential work After Virtue, puts it like this. Just as Hume seeks to found morality on the passions, that is to say on the belly, because his arguments have excluded the possibility of founding it on reason, the head. So Kant founds morality on reason, because his arguments have excluded the possibility of founding it on the passions, and Kierkegaard on criterionless fundamental choice, because of what he takes to be the compelling nature of the considerations, which exclude both reason and passions. And thus we have arrived at the situation Lewis outlines in his first lecture, which is entitled, remember, Men Without Chests. And one of the most memorable and indeed memeable lines of The Abolition of Man comes from the final paragraph of that opening lecture, where Lewis says, "We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful." Men without chests. The reason and the passions are at odds with each other, and no rapprochement seems possible. And it's this stalemate that Lewis seeks to overcome with his emphasis on the middle element, the sort of airlock, so to speak, between the two other departments. Focus on the chest, Lewis says. Forget the other two departments for a moment. Focus on the place where the high and the low meet, where the northern and southern hemispheres touch. That's the thing that should capture our attention, and the important fact we should observe about this chest is not so much how it connects the head and the belly, though Lewis does say something about that. He's more interested in simply saying that it does connect the head and the belly. The chest is the liaison officer between reason and passion. Precisely how it integrates reason and passion is a bit mysterious. It's mysterious because we are human beings. We're inside this reality, and we can't step outside it and remain human. We find ourselves within this human nature, even if we sometimes prefer that we might not be. If we try to climb outside our human nature and start looking for some more fundamental category by which we might define our humanity, we will enter upon a futile search. We'll be trying to jump off our shadows. We'll be chasing our tails. Now, the reason I say that this emphasis upon the chest is a subtle and implicit Christian apologetic is because of what Lewis says elsewhere in a 1945 essay, where he homes in on the importance of uniting head and belly in a more religious context. He says this, talking about different religions: "We may divide religions as we do soups into thick and clear. By thick, I mean those which have orgies and ecstasies and mysteries and local attachments. Africa is full of thick religions. By clear, I mean those which are philosophical, ethical, and universalizing. Stoicism, Buddhism, and the ethical church are clear religions. Now, if there is a true religion, it must be both thick and clear. For the true God must have made both the child and the man, both the savage and the citizen, both the head and the belly." Interesting use of those same terms from Abolition in this more explicitly religious essay. He goes on to say that in his view, the only two religions that fulfill this condition of uniting head and belly are Hinduism and Christianity. But then he says Hinduism fulfills the condition imperfectly, because the clear religion of the Brahmin hermit in the jungle and the thick religion of the neighboring temple go on side by side. The Brahmin hermit doesn't bother about the temple ritual, nor the worshipper in the temple about the hermit's metaphysics. But Christianity, Lewis says, really breaks down the middle wall of partition between head and belly. There he's alluding, of course, to Ephesians 2:14. Christ hath broken down the middle wall of partition between Jew and Gentile. Lewis goes on to say that Christianity takes a convert from Central Africa and tells him to obey an enlightened universal ethic. It takes a 20th century academic prig like me this is Lewis speaking, and tells me to go fasting to a mystery, to drink the blood of the Lamb. The savage convert has to be clear, I have to be thick. That is how one knows one has come to the real religion. What is Lewis saying here? Well, as we've seen in Abolition, he's saying that all great religious traditions are by definition human by virtue of the fact that they recognize objective value. Here, in this essay I've just been touching upon, he goes a step further and claims that the religamenting of head and belly is achieved most fully in Christianity. But the interesting thing is that the claim is already implicit in abolition, I think. And I say that because of the repeated discussion in abolition of the question of death for a good cause. In both the first and the second lectures, Lewis focuses in on the maxim of the Roman poet Horace, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, it's sweet and seemly to die for one's country. He says this, when a Roman father told his son that it was a sweet and seemly thing to die for his country, he believed what he said. He was communicating to the son an emotion which he himself shared, and which he believed to be in accord with the value which his judgment discerned in noble death. He was giving the boy the best he had, giving of his spirit to humanize him as he had given of his body to beget him. But it's hard to believe that death for one's country could be sweet and seemly, Lewis concedes. It's hard to believe that because, well, first of all, if we're being literal-minded, how could death be sweet? Death is not something to eat, he says, and therefore cannot be dulce in the literal sense, and it's unlikely that the real sensations preceding death for one's country will be dulce even by analogy. As for decorum, he says, as for it being seemly, fitting, that's only a word describing how some other people will feel about your death when they happen to think of it, which won't be often and will certainly do you no good. Refreshingly cynical there, Lewis. Horace's maxim had been thoroughly attacked and debunked in the early 20th century, most famously by the war poet Wilfred Owen in his poem Dulce et Decorum Est. Wilfred Owen calls Horace's maxim an old lie. Do not believe it, Owen says. Why not? Because the young men who found themselves in the trenches of the First World War discovered that it was not at all sweet and fitting to die for their country. On the contrary, they found it brutal and hellish. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye who cheer as soldier boys go by, creep home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go. That's not Owen, I think that's Siegfried Sassoon, but it makes the same point. 750,000 British servicemen were killed in the Great War, and C.S. Lewis himself was very nearly one of them. Here is Lewis in the uniform of an officer cadet. It's the only photograph of the young Lewis. He's 19 years old here in uniform. He went off to the trenches of France, arriving in the front line on his 19th birthday. And he discovered that war was, well, you've read the great war poets, I expect. You know much of what it was like for so many of them. The mechanization of combat in the First World War, the industrial slaughter brought about by modern artillery meant that a great many more men discovered the reality of battle than in previous wars. And Lewis, serving for about 6 months on active service, and very nearly being killed in the spring of 1918 when a shell fell in his trench and just obliterated the man next to him, was very nearly one of those fatalities. Of course, he didn't die. He was invalided back to England, and he spent 6 months recovering from his war wounds. But he didn't conclude from this horrific experience that there never could have been or never could again be such a thing as noble death for one's country, let alone that there could be no such thing as objective value. Why not? Because the sweetness and the fittingness of death for a good cause had never referred to the subjective experience of the particular soldiers dying in pain on the battlefield. It's painful. It's not sweet to die for one's country. Nonetheless, death for a good cause is sweet and seemly. The objective reality and the subjective experience may be out of kilter, but that doesn't, of necessity, undermine the validity of the objective value. Dulciet decorum est claimed to be an objective statement, a statement about a reality beyond one's immediate sensations and very probably counter to one's immediate interests. It's only when we suffer for doing the right that we realize that it's objective. For as long as it's subjectively pleasing to us, it might just be an expression of our personal preference. And Lewis persists in examining this example of death for a good cause, not, of course, because martyrdom is the only virtue, but because this is the crucial experiment, the experimentum crucis, which shows different systems of thought in the clearest light. But what does all this have to do with Christianity? Well, it's very important to observe how, in the second lecture, Lewis pairs Horace's maxim with Christ's statement, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." John 15, verse 13. Lewis says this: "An innovator in values," that is to say, a subjectivist, someone who denies the objective moral law, "an innovator in values regards dulciet decorum and greater love hath no man as mere irrational sentiments which are to be stripped off in order that we may get down to the realistic or basic ground of this value." And the slipping in here of Jesus' statement is very interesting. It's brief. Lewis draws no particular attention to it, but it's crucial, I think, as we try to understand the relationship between the philosophical presentation that Lewis is making and his underlying Christian commitments. Lewis sees in Horace's words, "Dulciet decorum est pro patria mori," he sees in Horace a pagan equivalent of a venerable dominical utterance. Horace and Jesus express the same truth. Yet another example of an overlap between natural theology and revealed theology. Between natural law and what Christians believe to be the prime example of self-sacrificial love in the person of Jesus. Now, the fact that death for a good cause usually involves pain explains why it is the critical experiment, the crucial test of an ethical system. For as long as moral choices are painless, it's hard to tell whether we're undertaking them for our own sake or not. Lewis expands on this point in The Problem of Pain. He says, "We agree with Aristotle that what is intrinsically right may well be agreeable, and that the better a man is, the more he will like it. But we agree with Kant so far as to say that there is one right act, that of self-surrender, which cannot be willed to the height by fallen creatures unless it is unpleasant. The doctrine of death, which I describe, is not peculiar to Christianity. Nature herself has written it large across the world in the repeated drama of the buried seed and the re-arising corn. The Indian ascetic, mortifying his body on a bed of spikes, preaches the same lesson. The Greek philosopher tells us that the life of wisdom is a practice of death. We can't escape the doctrine by ceasing to be Christians, for it is an eternal gospel, revealed to men wherever men have sought or endured the truth, the unescapable knowledge which the light that lighteneth every man presses down upon the minds of all who seriously question what the universe is about. Lewis had accepted the existence of this rational but painful moral law long before he believed in God. From his earliest years onward, Lewis spoke highly of literature such as the Aeneid and the Hippolytus, which showed the beauty and the value of painful obedience. In a letter of 1946, Lewis writes, "I've just reread the Aeneid again. The effect is one of the immense costliness of a vocation, combined with a complete conviction that it is worth it. The whole story of the Aeneid is littered with the cost." And this belief in the universality of painful self-surrender, of painful obedience to an objective standard outside oneself, helps explain the way that Lewis concludes the Abolition of Man in the appendix. He concludes with 3 examples of what he calls the Law of Magnanimity. The chest, as we've seen, is the defining part of a human being. The chest is the seat of magnanimity, so it's highly appropriate that Lewis should end with examples of the law of magnanimity. And it's particularly interesting, I think, to examine the final 3 citations and consider why he's chosen to finish the book with these 3 successive chords. The first of these 3 citations is from Plato's Phaedo. "Is not the love of wisdom a practice of death?" With the second citation, Lewis moves the reader from ancient Greek philosophy to Old Norse poetry, the Havamal. "I know that I hung on the gallows for 9 nights, wounded with the spear as a sacrifice to Odin, myself offered to myself." The third and final citation that Lewis uses to exemplify the law of magnanimity is taken from the Gospel according to St. John, the words of Jesus himself. "Verily, verily, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He who loves his life loses it." And these last 3 citations and their ordering are very interesting, I think. This is a way in which Lewis implicitly communicates his Christian theology, even in this work of avowed philosophy. These 3 statements mark a progress from pagan wisdom about human death to pagan wisdom about divine death, about a God sacrificing himself to himself. They end up with Christian wisdom spoken by the one who is both divine and human, the God-man, Jesus Christ himself. As he puts it in his book Miracles, a preliminary study, Jesus Christ is the representative dyer of the universe, and for that very reason, the resurrection and the life. So, the Abolition of Man ends on a note of death, good death, as do so many of Lewis's works, by the way. If man is to avoid the abolition predicted in these lectures, there are many and various traditions of wisdom on which to draw, as the appendix shows. But the ordering of these final 3 quotations and their placement at the end of the book subtly indicate where Lewis himself thought wisdom had reached its highest point, where the moral chest had found its fullest development. So, to conclude, pardon this next image, we mustn't have an excess of the belly. We must not have an excess of appetite and sensation. But in getting our belly into shape, we mustn't think we can just lose weight and work on the chest, as it were, morally speaking. This image represents no improvement on that image? Not really. Why not? Because this image, there's no head. We need a head as well as a chest and a belly. The head rules the belly through the chest. The chest is the indispensable liaison officer between reason and passion. It's the seat of magnanimity, the great soul that defines our very humanity. And of all attempts to be human, the greatest, the only truly successful attempt is that of Jesus Christ. When a Christian looks at this image, it's but a short step to this image. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. It is to Jesus Christ, crucified and risen from the dead, that Lewis would have his readers look if they are truly seeking after humanity. Thank you very much.